October the 21st, 1805. Off the Cape of Trafalgar in the unforgiving North Atlantic, British warships are locked in a savage battle with a combined French and Spanish fleet. It was to prove a crushing British victory, but the price would be the death of the Royal Navy's most celebrated commander, Horatio Nelson.
Nelson had a huge sense of destiny. He had this sense that he was going to die a hero. He was going to die a hero in his greatest victory.
The victory ensured Britain's supremacy at sea for more than a century. But things could have been very different. Was Napoleon's Franco-Spanish fleet closer to victory at Trafalgar than historians have previously claimed?
It was a very close-run thing. The French and the Spanish fought with far greater gallantry, far more determination than the British had expected.
Now, new technology and groundbreaking historical detective work are shedding crucial new light on the Battle of Trafalgar and the qualities of a man remembered as the greatest naval leader in history. Just how much did Nelson risk at the Battle of Trafalgar? In 1805, Europe had been engulfed in war for nearly a decade. Napoleon dominated mainland Europe and was poised to invade his most bitter enemy, Britain. But crossing the English Channel, French troopships would be vulnerable to attack from British warships. And so Napoleon combined the French fleet with that of Allied Spain in order to protect the invasion force. Knowing that destruction of this combined fleet was the key to averting invasion, Nelson and other British admirals pursued and blockaded the French and Spanish, trying desperately to bring them to a decisive battle. By October 1805, after nearly 2 years at sea, Nelson had the combined fleet cornered at Cadiz, near Gibraltar.
Other admirals instituted close blockades, so they would almost literally block the French fleet up in harbour. Nelson took the exact contrary view, and he instituted loose blockade, whereby he was encouraging the French to come out, and he would then be able to bring them to battle and defeat them.
The events surrounding the resultant battle have become legendary. Nelson conceived an elaborate, daring new plan of attack and carefully orchestrated the battle. The boldness of the plan and Nelson's charismatic leadership ensured the defeat of Napoleon's combined fleet. Because it was such a resounding victory, Trafalgar is often regarded as a foregone conclusion. But the latest research is showing that Britain's most famous naval triumph was anything but inevitable. In the long months of blockade that preceded Trafalgar, Nelson had come under severe political pressure. The British government desperately needed a victory.
Clearly, Nelson wanted a major battle of annihilation. He recognized that there needed to be a victory to help buoy up the coalition, because it was quite likely Napoleon would do quite well on land. He had a habit of doing that. Therefore, the British had to demonstrate as dramatically as possible that they were dominant at sea. And no matter how many times Napoleon might win on land, he couldn't win the war.
But most large-scale naval actions at this time were anything but decisive.
The traditional form of naval battle was both sides to form in a single line, and 2 lines to come up against each other like that and fire at each other. Now, the problem with that type of battle was usually it was very indecisive. It might last for perhaps even several days in some cases, with neither side actually winning a victory. Nelson's idea was to develop a battle that would ensure a victory.
Instead of the usual linear approach, Nelson decided to attack head-on with his ships in columns to break the line of the French and Spanish fleet and provoke a decisive close-quarter battle. But there was a drawback to this tactic.
To actually sail into an enemy line meant you were vulnerable to all the ships in the line as you came in. So it was a calculated risk. But Nelson knew that if you did manage to penetrate an enemy line with the wind behind you, the enemy would have great difficulties getting away, and that you could bring on what he always called a pell-mell battle. It was, in many respects, a very reckless gamble.
Historians have always believed that such a radical approach must have been carefully prepared before the battle. Until recently, there was only anecdotal evidence for this, including accounts of Nelson explaining his plan to colleagues and friends throughout 1805. But at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, a major new clue has been found. Colin White was conducting routine research into the 5,000 or so documents in the Nelson papers when he made an amazing discovery.
I came across a list of names on a fairly small piece of paper. It was a list of favours that he wanted to get for protégés of his. And then, as one is always taught to do, I turned it over.
On the back was a small pen and ink sketch, strikingly similar to the layout of the Battle of Trafalgar. It showed a single line representing an enemy fleet, with Nelson's fleet in 3 divisions breaking through at right angles. Far from a highly elaborate and detailed plan, the diagram is little more than a brief sketch. But Colin believes it also holds a vital clue as to Nelson's state of mind as he prepared for the battle.
This is the excitement of this particular diagram. This is not a carefully drawn battle plan with "this is my plan for the Battle of Trafalgar" on it. This is a very quick thumbnail sketch done to accompany a conversation. And in fact, right in the centre there, you can see that he's got so excited in saying that he's going to drive through the line that he dug into the page and the ink has blotted.
The emphatic gesture suggests Nelson's desperation to finally defeat the combined fleet at sea, even if it meant acting impulsively with only the barest notion of a plan. It was a considerable gamble, and Nelson's flamboyant, maverick character was crucial to the plan.
Nelson had an immense ego, but he moderated that by a great dash of humanity. He was quite clearly loved by many people, and not just Lady Hamilton. He was a very popular commander, and he had a charisma which the men could easily see, and therefore he was able to get from his men and from his fleets a performance which perhaps no other officer could.
Always leading from the front, Nelson was no stranger to extreme personal danger. He'd been wounded several times in previous battles, losing his right arm at Tenerife. But the British would need more than their admiral's legendary charisma, for they were about to fight the most technologically advanced and powerful fleet in the world. By October 1805, the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson is blockading Napoleon's combined French and Spanish fleet at Cadiz in southwestern Spain. In command of the combined fleet was the French Admiral Pierre Villeneuve. He was under pressure from Napoleon. If the British Navy was not defeated before winter, his planned invasion of Britain would have to be abandoned. Time was running out. So though there were signs the weather was about to worsen, Villeneuve ordered his fleet to sea.
Here we are, dawn, October 21st, 1805, a date that will forever after live in the history of the Royal Navy. I'm standing just behind the British fleet, 27 ships of the line, the largest ones with 100 guns, the smallest with 64. And ahead of them, lit by the Iberian sunrise coming up in the east behind me, is what they've been waiting for and looking for. The Franco-Spanish fleet, 33 ships of the line, stretching really from one side of the horizon to the other. It looks like a formidable array of fighting power, but to Nelson, it's a target, inviting destruction.
The target included some of the most technologically advanced ships in the world. The French Navy in particular had conducted extensive research into hydrodynamics and ship design.
In the last century or so, from about 1730, the French had a reputation for building very good ships. The French ships tended to have finer lines underwater. They were slightly faster in good weather conditions. And the reason was that the French would stay in port till they saw an opportunity. They would then come out and they'd make a quick dash for wherever they were trying to go.
The Spanish, too, were well equipped with powerful ships, designed to protect convoys to their South American colonies.
Regarding the ship of the Spanish fleet, they made superb, well-designed ships, combining the gunnery power and the sailing facilities. It was a long research for decades to find out the middle way between a good machine for the combat and at the same time a good machine for the winds and the storms.
As well as superior design qualities, the combined fleet had another advantage over the British.
By Trafalgar, the British had 27 ships of the line. These were the big fighting ships, the equivalent of battleships perhaps in the 20th century. And the French and Spanish combined had 33. So they had really, technically, they had a substantially stronger fleet.
Was Nelson overconfident in taking on such a powerful force? What was it about the British Navy that Nelson had so much trust in? HMS Unicorn is the oldest British-built warship still afloat. Most of the remaining ships from this era have been completely restored by modern craftsmen. But miraculously, Unicorn has survived intact. Although she was built after the Napoleonic Wars, her design principles are identical to many of Nelson's ships at Trafalgar. Maritime archaeologists Robert Prescott and Dan Atkinson are experts on wooden-built sailing vessels. They're conducting a painstaking study of Unicorn to discover more about shipbuilding in the British Navy of Nelson's time. All over the ship are unique details of the lost art of wooden ship construction, from aspects of overall design to individual methods of timber jointing. But the evidence Robert and Dan are most interested in lies in the strange rune-like carvings embedded in the ship's beams and planking. These are the shipwrights marks, evidence of the individual craftsmen who built Nelson's navy.
The timber marks actually are a lovely indication of a sort of secret language within the dockyard, where the marks are actually understood within the working processes of the yard between the shipwrights and the officers who are superintending the works that are happening in the yard. And this is where it really starts happening, isn't it? Well, it's really the beams that we've been concentrating on, isn't it?
Their research has led Dan and Robert to believe that this secret language was evolving rapidly in Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. Nowhere more so than the place where Unicorn herself was built, the Royal Dockyard at Chatham in Kent. The largest of all the British shipyards, Chatham produced many of the ships in Nelson's fleet at Trafalgar, including his flagship, HMS Victory. An extraordinary discovery here ties in with Robert and Dan's research on board Unicorn. During recent restoration work, a number of massive timber beams were found preserved beneath a 200-year-old floor. More than 160 specimens were eventually recovered. They were identified as the framework of an early 19th century warship. It's a mystery why this particular ship was preserved disassembled in this way. But one advantage of this is that shipwrights' marks, similar to those on Unicorn, are more exposed.
This has this nice race mark here. This is carved by a shipwright using a race tool or a race knife. You see it's got a series of Roman numerals here. This is all part of the business of helping other shipwrights to understand where this is destined to go. They communicate with each other using these markings which they leave all over the place.
These race marks would have enabled shipwrights to quickly reassemble the vessel like a prefabricated kit.
We're beginning to see a measure of standardization here, and people are very careful to mark their work so that when it's sent from the carpenter's shop down to the ways where the shipwrights assemble the ship, everybody knows where it's going. This is the starboard hand end of the beam, and it's beam number 23, so that's the station mark along the length of the ship. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is down here, where you have die-stamped initials that have been struck in the end of the timber with a metal die. And we find this in a number of pieces throughout here. We have a series of sets of initials. There's a very sophisticated system of timber management emerging here, which enables the shipwrights in different parts of the yard to communicate with each other and understand exactly what's required of them.
This growing standardization meant that at the time of Trafalgar, the British Navy's shipbuilding and maintenance was becoming increasingly efficient. After months, even years at sea, British blockade ships could be effectively maintained by highly versatile dockyards. What the British fleet's warships lacked in size and speed, they made up for by being more practical and better maintained than those of their French and Spanish enemies. But there were more French and Spanish ships, and so they had more guns than the British. Nelson knew that his best chance was to create chaos, the pell-mell battle he'd been planning for months. The British fleet would have to sail directly into the enemy guns.
On the day of the battle itself, everyone in the British fleet knows that the battle is in the offing, because they know that the enemy fleet is out, and they know that their admiral is going to go after it. And so the ships are then signalled to get into two lines. He decides to go with two lines. There's an enormous sense of speed in this, because he wants to get the enemy as off balance as possible.
Nelson lacked sufficient ships for the three lines as he'd originally planned. Attacking regardless with only two made his tactics even riskier. Around midday, the attacking British ships are forming two ragged columns as they begin the long, exposed charge into the Franco-Spanish line.
Here we are, the British attack has begun. The two lines are formed. Nelson's line here, led by Victory. Collingwood's line here, led by Royal Sovereign. The other ships behind, more or less in formation. The plan now is to strike through the enemy line, get on the other side, where it's hard for the enemy to escape, and bring on what Nelson always called a pell-mell action.
The radical new battle tactic put not only Nelson's ships at enormous risk, but also his own personal safety.
There was a great deal of jostling for the head of the columns. Collingwood was leading his column, and Nelson was leading his. And the ships astern of Nelson, particularly HMS Temeraire, was trying to get past. And there's a famous moment where the Temeraire looked as if she was about to overtake the Victory, and Nelson comes out onto the deck and shouts at the captain, "I'll thank you, Captain Harvey, to keep your proper station, which is astern of the Victory." So there's that almost sense of excitement and jockeying going on, like knights riding in a cavalry charge.
The head-on charge meant the British ship's sails would be fully exposed, square on to the combined fleet. This played straight into the hands of the French and Spanish gunners.
What the French and Spanish are trying to do, the French in particular, I think, is to go for the enemy's sails, go for the rigging. So they try and dismast the ships. This is what we would now call a mobility kill.
As the British advanced, the flagship Victory and the other lead ships were defenseless, their own guns unable to bear on their enemy. What's more, the weather was changing and unusually calm winds made it agonizingly slow, no more than walking pace. Just how much of a risk was this? One way to find out is to establish how much cannon fire the Victory and Nelson were exposed to. To find out, Robert Prescott is making a study of the last surviving, truly original part of Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory. More than 50 feet wide, this sail would have been the main aiming point for the combined fleet gunners as Victory approached. It's a unique relic and still bears the battle scars of Trafalgar. Robert will conduct a survey of the damage in order to quantify how much and what types of enemy fire Victory sustained.
Taking this hull, for example.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it?
It's sort of got two straight lines, and yet the rest of it is pretty much curved. Have we got any ideas on that?
Well, one thing we have to be aware of is that the combined fleet will have been using a number of different projectiles.
Yes.
It'll be using round shot, and we would hope that one sees a fairly discreet puncturing of the sail with that. But they were also using chain shot and bar shot.
But some of the holes in the sail look distinctly odd. They're nothing like depictions of cannon-damaged sails in period paintings. It's possible that some of this damage may have been caused after the battle by souvenir hunters.
In a way, this looks very much as if it might be one of those, because that looks like a very straight cut edge. There's no fraying of the margins at all. I mean, a well-sharpened seaman's knife might well have done that.
Robert will first have to try and establish how much of the damage is original from the battle. The only way to do that is to inflict some damage of his own. On board the Victory, Nelson is racing headlong into the attack on the French and Spanish combined fleet. He's outnumbered and outgunned. How can we discover just how much of a risk Nelson was running? Robert Prescott wants to find out how much of the damage on Victory's foretopsail was caused by enemy cannon fire. This will enable him to assess how much fire Nelson exposed himself to. He's commissioned a sample sail made from flax canvas, exactly the same as Victory's foretopsail.
And although this is a really very small sail by the standards of the foretopsail, it is made in exactly the same way, made of the standard cloths, 2 foot in width, seamed up with a nice double seam here, and suspended by row bands from a spar. It's looking very good just now. Quite pleased with the way that's setting.
To reconstruct the kind of damage incurred at Trafalgar, Robert enlists the aid of cannon expert Colonel Simon West. French and Spanish gunners used various types of ammunition against enemy ships. The most basic was solid iron round shot.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. That is actually very interesting from our point of view, because you can see the impact of the ball, but you can also see this tearing, right?
It's fascinating.
Horizontal and vertical tearing. There's an awful lot of that sort of damage on the sail.
That on its own isn't a very effective shot, is it? I mean, from my
really.
point of view, you're not seeing something that's stopping the function of the piece of equipment.
Round shot would be effective in a lucky hit on a ship's mast. But other types of projectile were more suited against canvas and rope. Bar shot was designed to spin in flight, slicing through a wider area than round shot.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
But in this case, the range is too short for the bar shot to begin to spin, so it creates less destruction than expected.
From the look of the hull, it looks like a similar rip to the ones we had before. That said, if it hit something hard, like a mast, it would probably then immediately start spinning, and obviously there's lots more rigging in and amongst it, so it may just need that first impact to get it spinning and then rip through other material around.
A development on bar shot was the deadliest of all the projectiles the French and Spanish used. Chain shot.
Now the chain shot is simply two projectiles chained together, and this would have been left in on casting. They travel up the bore together, and as soon as they come out of the muzzle, they separate and will be immediately unstable and start spinning.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
But you can see that the chain's fully extended at this point.
In fact, you can even see marks from
the chain. Yes.
In fact, the chain, you can see the chain has ripped.
Yes, that's
all
right.
the way down.
Yeah.
So it's
like a cheese wire.
It wouldn't take many shots like that to reduce the power the sail is transmitting to the boat.
First one is the top hole there, the top smudge.
The top smudge. So that's number 3 there.
Back at their base in Chatham, Robert and Dan record and analyse the damage on the sample sail.
That one.
Each type of projectile has produced a different damage signature, which Robert compares with foretopsail damage.
Yeah, we have to do that. That's true. And many of those odd shapes, which people perhaps in the past have thought were not related to shot damage on Victory's foretopsail, I suspect are now, because one of the things that's so striking is the way the impact of the round shot in particular tears the warp and the weft of the sail and produces a lot of triangular shapes, very much the same as the ones we see on the Victory foretopsail.
Straight edges.
Yeah. Now that we know the kind of damage that we were able to produce in the experiment, if we go back to the foretopsail and we look at the damage which that has suffered, I think we can clearly identify those parts which are battle-related and those which are not. And in my view, it is very much the case that a good deal of that is battle-related and not souvenir-taking at all, much more battle damage to that sail than perhaps we had previously accepted.
The test has confirmed documentary accounts of the huge amount of firepower Victory sustained in the battle. If a single gun can inflict this amount of damage with only a few shots, Nelson and Victory were at huge risk from hundreds of French and Spanish cannons firing unopposed for 20 minutes. At around 30 minutes after noon, Victory smashed through the French and Spanish line.
Here we are, the point of contact. Up here, Collingwood ships are already engaged in their melee at the back end of the Franco-Spanish line. But here is Nelson's flagship. He's moving through the line with the enemy flagship on his left. As he passes in Victory, her guns, double, triple-shotted perhaps, fire a raking broadside right through the French flagship that causes horrendous casualties as these cannonballs bounce their way down through the French ship. Despite the huge risk, Nelson had succeeded in bringing on a pell-mell battle,
and the French and Spanish had failed to stop the British attack. Now, as the two fleets came to close action, everything would depend on the fighting prowess of individual crews. But for months leading up to Trafalgar, the combined fleet had been trapped at the Spanish port of Cadiz. Many crews were confined to their ships in the harbour. But in the old city, it's still possible to see the cramped tenements where many French and Spanish seamen were quartered in squalid conditions.
The streets here in Cadiz, of course, were full of sailors at the time. There were cafes just like now, drinking spots, and other spots where sailors like to congregate, chasing the women and all the rest of it. It was quite an intrusion, and you had them by the thousands.
Maritime historian René Chartrand believes this long confinement in harbour had serious consequences for both French and Spanish crews.
The training regime would have been minimal because of the possibilities of this place. You can't really fire powder and ball here, and so the training regime will tend to be going up and down the mast and so on, but otherwise very minimal. Of course, you get eventually half-trained crews.
But for the French Navy in particular, Cadiz was merely the last in a long line of catastrophes dating back to before the war with Britain. Only 20 years before Trafalgar, the French Navy had been at the height of its power. But everything changed in 1789 with the French Revolution.
The French officer corps was literally guillotined, and those that weren't left the country. There was tremendous technical neglect. The ships were left to basically rot in the harbors. A fleet is a very, very complicated thing, and it's a very technical thing that you don't neglect for 10 years. And of course, that's what they'd done. They neglected the fleet to an almost irreparable state.
But what of the other half of the combined fleet? The Spanish had no shortage of officers, and they were at least as well trained as officers in the British Navy, aided by the renowned academy at San Fernando. Why then were the Spanish ships of the combined fleet not more effective against the British?
We know that crewing of the Spanish ships in particular had been a problem. We know, for example, that some of the larger ships simply had, instead of sailors, they had army conscripts on board, firing the guns and so on.
But what could have caused the Spanish Navy's chronic manpower shortage? It was whilst researching Spanish climatological records for Trafalgar that meteorologist Dennis Wheeler made a chance discovery. Yellow fever.
This is a report published in Gibraltar on epidemic diseases, but in particular on yellow fever, contagious fevers in general. Fortunately for us, published in 1806. So this will have an account of the events of 1804 and indeed previous years to that, when yellow fever would have been sweeping through Andalusia.
Cadiz was badly affected by this epidemic, but just how crucial it was to the outcome of the Battle of Trafalgar only became clear when Dennis Wheeler met local historian Dr. Sam Bernardi.
There's been passing references to outbreaks of yellow fever and similar diseases in the early 19th century. Is there any evidence from the statistics you've got to hand to suggest that there might have been a particular influence on people in military service at the time?
Well, it was curious that of, I think it was something like 2,800 deaths reported in Cadiz in 1804, only 200 were women, which suggests to me that the epidemic it might have, if these figures are right, might have occurred in some sort of barracks area where there were only men.
In Cadiz, before Trafalgar, thousands of Frenchmen and Spaniards were still recovering from this epidemic. Nearly 3,000 had already died. Though Nelson could not have known it, the combined fleet was nowhere near full strength or efficiency. 30 minutes in, and the battle has become a series of savage individual duels between ships. The British are gaining the upper hand, but Nelson himself faces a stern challenge.
Coming up here is the important vessel, the French counterattack, Captain Lucas's Redoutable, the best-handled ship in the fleet. These two ships clash together. It's the closest of close actions, the signal which is still flying until it gets shot away from the mast of Victory. But Captain Lucas of Redoutable has his mast festooned with musketeers. They are going to make life quite literally impossible on the upper deck of Victory, and Nelson's personal fate is about to be decided.
The extraordinary French captain Jean-Jacques Lucas of the Redoutable was in a class apart.
Lucas was one of the few French captains who'd actually thought about the battle in advance. And so, ironically, the Victory comes up against the one ship that can really deal her a serious blow.
Lucas' battle plan was to engage as close as he could, and, if possible, board the largest possible ship that he could lay his hand on. And he had trained his men for this, trained them to hope for this, and by George, it happened.
While blockaded in Cadiz, Captain Lucas had trained his men ceaselessly till they were experts in boarding and musketry. But he had also trained them in the use of a far more devastating weapon. He knew that these primitive, hand-thrown grenades would prove highly effective at close quarters.
As the Victory comes alongside and gets locked together with her, the Redoutable shuts all her lower gun ports. The men from the lower gun ports are brought up onto the upper deck. There are men in the rigging as well, and they concentrate on firing on the Victory's upper deck.
Now there was Lucas' ship, which was a 74, a smaller ship than the Victory, certainly, but that didn't matter to him, because once they got in close to the Victory, within a few minutes, the decks of the Victory were practically emptied of men.
He'd survived the French and Spanish cannon fire, but faced with this furious close-range assault, Nelson was again in deadly peril.
Virtually nothing could live on the upper deck of Victory. The hail of fire that French ship had brought to bear was such that nothing could live there. It either had to take refuge or it died.
By 1 p.m., Redoutable's crew had turned Victory's upper deck into a smouldering ruin. And right in the midst of this chaos, in full view of the enemy, Nelson still paces the quarterdeck. He's dangerously, almost suicidally exposed.
There is a traditional view, almost a legend, of the death of Nelson, that there he is, slightly vain, covered in his orders and so on, an absolutely sitting duck.
Suddenly, as Nelson and his second-in-command turn, Nelson falls, struck by a single bullet. Though he's still conscious, it's clear to all around that their charismatic admiral is dying. Legend has it that one of Lucas' sharpshooters was able to identify Nelson because of the sparkling orders on his jacket. But how much of this legend is true?
If you look at Nelson's uniform in the National Maritime Museum, it's his rather threadbare working rig. Of course he had his orders on it, but they were embroidered, they weren't shining.
If he were not so visible as previously thought, could Nelson have been singled out by a French marksman, the way the legend suggests? By 2 p.m., the Battle of Trafalgar is swinging in favor of the British fleet. But Britain's Admiral Horatio Nelson, who had led the British attack, lies dying. Is it possible that his reckless plan for the battle has led directly to his own death?
In trying to understand how Nelson came to be shot, One needs to think oneself into the situation on the quarterdeck of the Victory on the 21st of October 1805. The Victory's upper deck is being swept by a swathe of bullets from all different positions and places.
At the scene of the shooting, the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, now moored in the English port of Portsmouth, a team of experts has assembled. They'll try to establish whether Nelson was killed by a deliberately aimed marksman's shot or simply by chance in the chaos of battle.
So far as we know, Hardy and Nelson were pacing down the middle of the deck here. Nelson on the right, Hardy on the left. The custom would be to pace together and to turn inwards so you could continue the conversation and then go back down this way. These guns are all firing. You've got a ship over there firing at you. You've got all the rigging in the way. So there's a huge amount of baffle. Yet this chap is supposed to be able to accurately spot that it's the Admiral and hit him from a distance of 40 yards when he's moving. I just find it difficult to believe that it was deliberately aimed.
Allowing for battle conditions, could it have been possible for a marksman to pick Nelson out individually on the quarterdeck? The team bring in period firearms expert Ivan Williams. He'll use exactly the same kind of smoothbore musket as used by Lucas's men on the Redoutable. But instead of musket balls, Ivan will use the latest Swedish military technology to measure his accuracy. The musket has been fitted with a small arms transmitter, or SAT. It's a weapon effect simulator, as used in training by the British Army. On the range with live rounds, Ivan ensures the musket's lethal accuracy. He and combat simulator expert Martin Ernesson then zero in the SAT. Triggered by a blank round, the SAT fires a laser representing the path of the bullet. If Ivan's on target, the receiver vest indicates a hit. From Nelson's position when he was hit and the detail on the wound, the team first attempt to establish what direction the bullet came from.
So if we're going through the back of that vertebra and we know that it's fairly close to the shoulder tip, if his shoulder was hunched forward a little bit more, we're looking at an angle that is perhaps shallower than people imagine.
Well, fascinatingly, you are pointing straight up at where the mizzen top would have been, in my opinion.
This matches exactly with surviving eyewitness accounts, which describe where the shot came from. Ivan will shoot from the approximate position of Redoutable's mizzen top, 20 meters above Victory's quarterdeck.
Killed. Killed. Wounded. Right arm. Killed.
9 out of 10 shots are on target, 7 of them fatal. Do the team believe Nelson could have been deliberately shot?
Having seen our friend walk through in the manner he did, and he was killed twice out of twice, my view is that I reckon that it was an aimed shot.
I am definitely not convinced, even though he got those kills, that it was on the day an aimed shot. I still think that there was just so much fire being aimed on this spot that he was going to get shot anyway.
The adrenaline up there would be considerable, however calm and used to it they were. And you have to say that it could have been an aim shot. You can, like Thomas Plunkett in the Rifles, you can never say it can't.
The weight of evidence suggests it's highly likely Nelson was felled by a deliberately aimed shot. Even without the conspicuous orders on his uniform, he was still extremely vulnerable. Given that Redoutable's men had already killed or wounded more than 50 of Victory's crew on the exposed deck, Nelson was lucky to have survived as long as he did.
Now the battle is over, and here we have the chaos of a pell-mell action, a melee. The ships are all over the place, the ordered lines have gone. But note, Every Franco-Spanish ship has a British ship alongside. This is a great and glorious victory. 18 ships of the line are now captured by the British. This is one of the greatest victories in naval history.
But hundreds of sailors, French, English and Spanish, lay dead on battered ships. Survivors felt themselves lucky to be alive. But for many, the ordeal was only beginning.
While the battle's being fought, the seas are getting higher. Nelson knows there's a storm coming in off the open Atlantic. Therefore, he leaves strict orders that after the battle, the fleet should go to anchor to weather this storm.
This was difficult enough for the British, but most of the combined fleet ships they had captured as prizes were severely battle damaged. It was no way to face a storm.
To be anchored, to be secure, night time's coming, a storm's on its way, is really all you could hope for in terms of security. They weren't able to do it. They didn't have the anchors, they didn't have the cables. In some cases, they didn't have the manpower.
Nelson had chosen to fight the battle, knowing it was a race against the weather. Once again, he had run a terrible risk. Even though the British fleet had won a victory, the survivors were now horribly exposed to a nightmarish storm. If the British fleet were lost, the victory would count for nothing. All but 4 of the 18 captured ships sank. More than 2,000 men who had survived the battle were lost at sea.
On the 22nd of October, the people in Cadiz saw a very horrible landscape. On the beaches, they saw corpses, mast, rigging, waste of the combined fleet.
Nelson won a crushing victory at Trafalgar, but had risked everything to achieve it. With a hazardous and impulsive plan, Nelson steered his fleet directly into a storm of fire. Fortunately for the British fleet, which had already secured victory, Nelson's death came too late to affect the final outcome of the battle. But his gamble with the weather was the greatest risk of all, and could have led to the loss of the British fleet itself. Nelson's place in history was assured. At a price of more than 5,000 Spanish, French, and British lives. They lie still in the treacherous dark waters off Cape Trafalgar. Spain was the superpower of the age. Under its king, Philip II, it had grown rich on religious crusades, imposing the Catholic faith on South America and plundering gold in return. Elizabeth I had long been a thorn in Philip's side, her country a rogue state, Protestant, poor, and piratical. Elizabeth encouraged adventurers like Francis Drake to attack Spanish treasure fleets and cut her in on the proceeds. It was a dangerous game.
Elizabeth had spent 20 years provoking Spain on and off. At one moment she was a superb appeaser, the next moment she was belligerent. She was steering the ship of state through the most dangerous waters this country has probably ever seen.
And Elizabeth's politicking was about to hit the rocks with the execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. In his palace outside Madrid, Philip had long prepared an invasion plan. It was ambitious, deploying 2 separate armies. The Armada would escort the first from Spain to the English Channel. There they would combine with troops from the Spanish Netherlands. Together, they would land in Kent and march on London. Elizabeth knew of Philip's plans, but could offer little resistance. While he had 2 regular armies, she had none. Her part-time militiamen were no match for Spanish professionals. England's only defense was the sea and the ships of the Royal Navy. But how good were they? History tells us that ship design changed radically under Elizabeth. Now, using computer modeling, John Adams, an archaeologist, can see just how far-reaching those changes were.
The ships of the Armada campaign represents almost a revolution. The way ships are conceived, designed, constructed and used has completely been rethought. And the benefits of that rethink, effectively, are manifested in the ships that fight the Armada.
It's clear that the English warship had been completely reinvented. From the bottom up, they were more streamlined, what a new generation of ship designers called race-built.
Race-built refers to the profile that these ships presented. If you looked at them side by side, one is a great big, bulky, much higher, taller structure, whereas the race-built galleon has a much sleeker, lower hull. The performance analysis that we've carried out indicates that ships of the Armada campaign would have been considerably faster. We also see the rig, the thing that powers the ship along, that is also changed as well. So it transmits more power per square foot. This allows the ship to be used in ways that are much more inventive.
But against the might of the Armada, would these technological advances prove enough? Elizabeth's Royal Navy was about to be put to the test. As the Armada entered the Channel on July the 29th, 1588, the English saw for the first time the scale of Philip's invasion force. The chains of beacons had been long prepared.
The beacons were a traditional system of giving warning of seaborne attack. The mechanisms were very well organized. Districts or parishes were responsible for maintaining their beacons, keeping permanent watchmen and so on. And it was a very effective system. It would work in most circumstances.
England was crisscrossed by a complex network of vantage points relaying signals by line of sight. They could communicate only one simple, pre-arranged message, but they did so with surprising speed.
I've seen a calculation based on modern experience with lighting beacons that the message could probably have got from Plymouth to Carlisle, i.e. the northernmost frontier of England, in about 40 minutes.
As the beacons flared, there was trepidation among the English in Plymouth. What would the Spanish do?
All they were confronted with was this enormous fleet. Nothing like it had been seen in the Channel since Roman times. So finally, the great forces of the Antichrist, as they would look at it, had arrived in the Channel in strength.
But the Channel is a capricious stretch of water, and in the age of sail, both sides were at the mercy of the elements. Every twist and turn in the battle to come would depend on the vagaries of weather, tide, and current. 4 centuries later, is it possible to pinpoint the weather faced by the Armada? On the coast of Northern Ireland, where many Spanish ended up, Ken Douglas, a self-taught meteorologist, believes that it is.
The weather certainly was the key. There wasn't any secret about that. But nobody had actually tried to put it together in modern meteorological terms.
Ken Douglas has used the ship's logs from the Spanish and English fleets to piece together a picture of the daily weather observations for 1588.
I could see from that there was information there giving us wind speeds, whether it was raining, etc., wind directions. And it seemed logical just to put those on a map and see if it was possible to turn those into some kind of synoptic charts.
A synoptic chart is a standard weather map showing high and low pressure areas in the atmosphere. In areas of high pressure, the winds rotate clockwise. In low pressure areas, anti-clockwise. Knowing the ship's positions and their recorded wind directions, Ken could calculate the weather throughout the entire campaign. Now, for the first time, this data can be combined with computer images to create a daily weather map for the Armada.
From the period after they entered the Channel, the luck seemed to favour the Spaniards. A high-pressure cell developed to the northwest, and in high pressure, the winds circulate clockwise, so that the wind would be from the west. It also produces good weather, and it stayed with them the rest of the week.
Everything favoured the Spanish. They were in open sea with the wind behind them. At anchor in Plymouth, the English were a sitting target. Yet when Sir Francis Drake was warned of the threat, he is said famously to have shown more concern for his afternoon sport than for the approaching Spanish.
This was a dramatic moment. This was the Spanish fleet of 130-odd ships found in the western approaches just off the Lizard. Drake's response is one of cool, calculated, phlegmatic dismissal, that there is plenty of time to deal with this enemy and finish the game of bowls. Whether it's absolutely correct, we don't know, but it works. It's a piece of theatre and it's gone into the Armada legend.
But why did Drake do nothing? Looking at the tide patterns for that July day, Steve Hall, an oceanographer, reckons he simply had no choice.
It's possible to predict quite accurately what the state of the tide and the current flow would be. And we can see that if Drake had been wanting to finish his game of bowls, there wasn't really anything he could do until 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening anyway, because of the state of the tide. There was no way of getting those ships into the English Channel.
The English lay helpless, but the Spanish made no attempt to strike. Their commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had orders to keep strictly to Philip's battle plan.
18,000 Spaniards ashore in Plymouth would have been quite a headache for us. Fortunately, the Spanish orders were so inflexible that this golden opportunity that the Duke of Medina Sidonia might have taken advantage of was missed there for Spain.
An opportunity which the English seized as the tide turned. Upwind, the Spanish were still confident, but they were about to be confounded by the quickness of the English warships.
Because the English ships were capable of sailing much closer to the wind than the Spanish thought, to their horror, the Spanish found the English ships working their way behind them, ahead of them, around their fleet, and getting into tactically advantageous positions that they hadn't anticipated at all.
The Spanish ships couldn't compete. They were solidly built, but lacked the nimbleness of the English.
We have two images here. One is generically English type of galleon, and another is a reconstruction of the San Diego, a Spanish galleon. Just in looking at the two profiles, you can see that the English hull form is slightly more compact. The castle structure is a little bit lower. The Spanish galleon has a much longer forward raking stem, a shorter keel by comparison, and a much more angular rake in the sternpost. And perhaps some of the differences that we see are part of the reason why the performance of the English ships in 1588 so surprised the Spanish.
The English had used the maneuverability of their ships to seize the advantage of wind and weather from the Spanish. Now they could dictate tactics.
The important thing about gaining the weather gauge or getting upwind of the enemy is it gives you total flexibility of maneuver. You can either attack or pull away as you will. Those who are downwind really have to react to what you're doing. They're not in a position to really do much about it. You can drop down from upwind on them. It's very hard for them to claw their way back up to get at you.
It was the Spanish who were vulnerable now, but they responded quickly. They switched into the defensive crescent formation used by their treasure fleets.
The Spaniards were very experienced at organizing defensive convoys. They'd been doing it for a long time. And it was a good formation. The English could really only attack the trailing wings where the main Spanish warships were stationed. They couldn't safely penetrate into the gap between because it would have been too easy for them to be trapped by the Spanish ships.
The Spanish expected that any fighting would be at close quarters. That was how sea battles had always been fought. But the English had a new kind of warfare in mind. They intended to sink the Spanish at long range.
What was new was that the English were carrying into action much heavier gun batteries than anybody had done before. And the Spaniards were well aware of this, and they were intensely concerned that they were going to find themselves facing a weight of gunfire which they couldn't possibly match.
And this was the weapon the Spanish feared most, the long-barreled cannon known as the culverin, or snake. To the English, it was a ship killer, but would it prove the decisive factor in sinking the Spanish?
Culverins are characterized by having these long, slender barrels in relation to their caliber. The caliber of this gun's about 5.5 inches. The reason for this long proportion is probably because they believed that you get the maximum benefit from the burning powder charge in the long barrel, and it would probably fire quite accurately as well. But it's a high velocity weapon. I mean, we're getting a very fast moving cannonball going more or less straight where you aim it.
For the Elizabethans, it was a super weapon. But how deadly was the culverin? Nick Hall is about to put this replica to the test on a modern firing range. '16th century gunnery was a black art with few scientific principles. Gunners worked by trial and error, and their knowledge of ballistics was limited. But on paper, the culverin appeared formidable, with a range of over 600 yards at 0 elevation.
Okay, distance is 307 metres over.
Nick Hall and his colleagues are examining these claims using 21st century tools, high-speed cameras, and Doppler radar.
Undercover!
Gun ready.
Stand by. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
The culverin's opening shot is well over a quarter of a mile, already close to the performance claimed by the Elizabethan gunners.
Did you get that muzzle velocity?
No.
408 meters per second, and the distance for the long-range warm-up shot was 477.8 meters. So 477.8 meters. I mean, that's good. So that's almost horizontal, isn't it? And that's nearly the range that Born in 1587 is saying with 666 yards.
Yeah.
What those early gunners could not have dreamed of measuring was the speed of the cannonball leaving the muzzle. At over 400 meters a second, the 24-pound iron shot is traveling at above the speed of sound. The culverin, then, has a powerful reach, but how accurate is it? We know that the Spanish feared above all the sharpshooting of the English gunners.
Philip II briefed his commanders that the English would try to shoot low. They would try to damage the Spanish hulls, ideally just below the waterline.
So what do you think we are? We're slightly left?
Well, I thought...
Slightly right.
We're slightly
right,
but
aren't we?
It's time to try the culverin against a target, just 10 feet square, but the thickness of a ship's hull. The target is 150 meters away, the gun barrel dead level.
3, 2, 1, fire!
But the cannonball flies high.
On the negative side, we missed the target by an appreciable amount, but we would have had a very good hit on the ship.
It was well within the bounds of the ship, wasn't it?
Yes.
Striped markers indicate the overall length of the imaginary ship, but only a direct hit on the woodwork will produce real damage. Wooden galleons were surprisingly hardy, as the Elizabethan gunners soon found. It was one thing to hit the enemy, but to sink them needed repeated shots on target. Accurate and consistent fire at a time when most sailors had no knowledge of maths or science. Our present-day gunners have different problems. 21st century know-how ought to give them an edge, but their mental arithmetic seems to confuse even them.
We reckon it was about 6 foot higher, so we want to come down about 12 feet, don't we?
Well, that's
4
not
meters.
30
4
centimeters,
meters.
is it?
4 meters want to come down?
Yeah. And what's that in mils?
4 meters in mils.
4,000.
That range.
A mil subtends a meter at 1,000, so at 100 it subtends 0.1 of a mil.
I'm sure you're right.
The logic is clear enough. If the shot is flying too high, the gun must be lowered. But the muzzle's already below horizontal.
About there?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
Amazingly, even with the gun pointing down, the shot is still going skywards. The experts agree to aim lower still.
The shot went straight over the top of the target, and I saw it impact in the ground at about 1,000 meters. So it's gone well over the top of the target. So we'd actually need to lower the elevation quite considerably, I think.
But in reality, how much more would you depress a gun?
We probably want to come down almost 100 mils, so we were looking at bringing it down about 4 or 5 degrees.
But the radar will tell you whether it's hit.
Respect is rising for the English gunners of 400 years ago. It's hard enough to aim the culverin on dry land, let alone on a pitching warship in full sail.
Well, is this it?
That's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, that's perfectly in line. Look at it.
And suddenly recognition dawns. The reason that the shot is flying high is staring them in the face. A telltale track where it's ricocheted off the ground.
Why don't we split the difference?
Well, maybe we just leave it where it is.
We're sure this happened from this firing and not one of the earlier ones.
Yeah, because we haven't seen this slide.
One yet.
What did the radar?
Belatedly, the 21st century gunners realize they've been aiming too low all along. It's time to beat the retreat.
So what we've done now is effectively raised the gun by 40 minutes. So 40 minutes is about 10 mils. So therefore, theoretically, we should raise it 1.5 meters on the target. That would be 10 meters at a kilometer. So that would be 1 meter.
They're averaging just one cannon shot an hour, with as yet no hits. The Elizabethan gunners managed exactly the same rate of fire, but even after 6 days at sea, they too had made little impression on the enemy. And such heavy long-range shooting had used precious powder and shot.
Of course, one of the big questions is why the English fleet or the Royal Navy was so relatively ineffective. It had the advantage of the weather gauge, it had the advantage of the fast manoeuvrable ships, it had the advantage of heavy artillery, yet had to break off the attack because it was using up too much ammunition, and it had had very little to show for itself.
It was round one to the Spanish, and with English hopes crumbling, the way was now open for the Armada to follow through with its long-planned invasion. In Flanders, the soldiers of the Duke of Parma were waiting. These were the crack troops that would lead the Spanish invasion of England. All that was needed was the ships to get them there. Out in the Channel, the Armada had left their English pursuers trailing. But a crucial flaw now appeared in the Spanish invasion plans. Their commander, Medina Sidonia, discovered there was no port large enough for him to take Parma's army on board.
Medina Sidonia was clearly extremely worried about what the outcome would be, because he didn't really see how this vital link-up with the Duke of Parma was actually going to take place. He began to realize that total disaster was in the offing.
For 6 days, the Spaniards had run the gauntlet of English firepower in the Channel. Now they had no choice but to heave to in open sea. They were at anchor and vulnerable, and the weather was turning.
The Armada's luck was beginning to run out. They'd had a good time coming up the channel as far as wind was concerned, but as the day progressed, they came under the influence of low pressure to the northeast, and that produced northwest winds which got stronger all the time.
And it's now clear that it wasn't just the weather that was beginning to conspire against the Spanish.
It's a full moon. We're going to have some very strong tides with strong tidal flows, and the Spanish wouldn't really be able to get out, certainly not in formation. We're coming up to the evening. We see it gets to 8:30, 9 o'clock, the tide changes. Strong tides, about 3 knots. And so these ships would have been pinned against the coast at the mercy of the wind and the tide and the English.
The English had a plan. A handful of ships would be sacrificed. Soaked in pitch and set ablaze, they would become weapons of terror, carried on the rising tide deep into the Spanish fleet. With their defensive shape broken, the scattered Spanish troopships made easy targets. For the first time, the English could now close on the enemy.
This is the point at which the English started firing at very close range. And this is the point, it's clear, when Spanish ships are beginning to suffer serious damage and heavy casualties.
At long range, the English guns had been ineffective. Now, at close quarters, they proved fearsome.
We are beginning to see, I think, enormous damage being inflicted on the Spanish ships. Their decks have been raked by round shot. Swathes of splinters are scything through men. Anything with soft tissue is being cut down and severely damaged. Rigging, structures of the boat are being smashed. The Spanish effectively are taking a terrible pounding at this stage, and the hammering is getting worse, getting more and more intense.
Yet while the English were out shooting the Spaniards, they still had difficulty sinking them. Medina Sidonia's flagship was hit 200 times but kept sailing, and the English powder and shot were almost spent.
They were firing, in comparison with the Spaniards, much more quickly, much more effectively, and causing real damage to the Spanish ships. But it was relatively limited. They just didn't have the ammunition stocks to keep up the continuous attrition which is necessary to physically disable or sink a wooden ship.
Quite frankly, there was not enough firepower going down to stop the Armada. We could not put enough weight of fire into various vessels to slow them down. Otherwise, we would have expected far higher casualty rate.
Go to slightly more elevation, it's not a problem.
7 degrees?
Even at close range, it seems, the English still had a problem achieving the consistent and accurate fire that they needed. So can our present-day gunners do any better? Just as their predecessors closed on the Armada, they too are hauling in their target to just 50 meters. Drake would have approved.
1, fire! 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 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire! Oh, I heard something.
What happened?
Shit. I saw the ball, or what I thought actually was a bit of the target flying off.
Oh, God, that's impossible.
War is hell, but this is worse. Firing at a fixed target at point-blank range, a fusillade of gunfire has brought just one tantalizing, possible strike.
I wonder whether it just kissed the top, which would give you a sound. Look. I'm right.
What?
Look.
It's either the narrowest of misses or a glancing hit. Nick knows which theory he favours.
And it gave a dong, didn't it?
It was definitely a dong.
I'm not just clutching at straws. But I'm convinced the the sound was right.
Yeah.
And I think that bright piece of metal there on the front of that, well, the edge of that flange, and the bit of muck on that flange.
Then it went off to the right, didn't it?
I was going, that I was going to see a hole in the target, because I just saw the ball, but most of the target was hidden by smoke, and I thought then, as the smoke cleared, I'd see a hole. And obviously we didn't. It's just a question of...
Oh, do you want me to...
No, I'm not going to fall.
There's only one way to prove it. Time to inspect the evidence close up.
Whether I get down again, it's nothing.
No, and then what is it? 'Cause it looks like it's from here.
I thought that was some nice gunpowder fouling. That is from the forklift.
Right. Grease from the forks. More
I think I might have to retract.
How are you going to get down now?
I don't know.
400 years ago, the Elizabethan gunners were also left high and dry. They had put their faith in heavy guns like the Culverin, but that hadn't been enough.
Every generation has its new super weapon. They all think it's going to work wonderfully. They've all done trials. But when it comes to the real war, somehow things are different. Well, it was the same with their new heavy guns. It didn't work as well as they thought it was going to, and they were a long way from having worked out the most effective ways to use smooth-bore, muzzle-loading guns.
The Spanish were battered but unbroken. The English in good order but desperate for ammunition. No glorious victory, just a standoff.
It was essentially a draw. Neither had achieved what it wanted to achieve. The Spaniards hadn't landed in England, but equally, the English hadn't defeated the Spaniards. The Armada was still in good order, its discipline, formation was intact, and it was still a very formidable force. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was in charge.
And Medina Sidonia was still determined to carry out the invasion plan. What settled matters was not the English, but the weather. An onshore wind now threatened imminently to break the Armada against the Dutch coast. But just when catastrophe seemed certain, the wind reversed direction and blew them back out to sea. To the Spanish, there was only one explanation: divine intervention.
The Spanish thought this change of wind was a miracle, but we can now see that a high pressure cell had developed and come in just at exactly the right moment for them. Produced southwest wind, and that enabled them to escape into the North Sea.
But once in the North Sea, and with the wind behind them, there could be no going back for the Armada. Their invasion plans were put on hold. Now Medina Sidonia's priority was to get his Armada safely home to Spain, and there was only one way to do it: the long way round. This is the route that he set for his fleet, taking them north of Scotland and far out into the Atlantic before heading south and homewards. He was well aware of the dangers.
They were to make as much seaway into the Atlantic as they could so that they get a safe run southward to Spain. Because the great danger was to be caught by the prevailing westerly winds and dashed on the wild Atlantic coasts of Scotland and Ireland. And he took particular care to say, take great heed lest you fall upon the island of Ireland for fear of the harm that might happen to you upon that coast.
Orders from Medina Sidonia were not to be taken lightly. He was a disciplinarian who had already executed one Armada captain for breaking formation. But despite his orders to stay clear of Ireland, within weeks, 3,000 of his men would end up dead on its shores. No one has ever questioned how that came to be. But now we can reveal new evidence that the Spanish were victims of a natural phenomenon. one which made it impossible to follow their commander's orders. Blooded but unbeaten, the Spanish Armada was heading homewards, forced by the weather to take the long northern passage out into the Atlantic. Medina Sidonia had given particular orders to stay clear of Ireland's dangerous coast. So how did a third of his fleet end up shipwrecked there? To search for clues, Ken Douglas has gone back to the ship's logs of the Armada. They reveal the disquiet of one man in particular, a senior officer called Marcos de Aramburu. Aramburu was an experienced and professional seafarer, and he left a detailed account of how, despite all his efforts to steer out into the Atlantic, he still ended up on the Irish coast.
This is Medina Sidonia's sailing instructions as we've seen. Marcos de Aramburu kept a careful log of his positions, and on certain dates he estimated how far west he had got. And on the 9th of September, he was at 54 degrees north. He estimated he was 360 miles west of Ireland. But on the 11th of September, after just 2 days sailing, he was on the Irish coast. It would have been impossible for him to sail that distance in 2 days. The implication's obvious. He was never as far west as he thought he was, so he could never have been out there.
So how had Aramburu ended up on the coast? Working back painstakingly from his landfall, Ken Douglas discovered that he had in fact been steering an erratic course 300 miles further east than he thought. He records soundings on the seabed which would have been impossible in the deep ocean. It's a colossal error of navigation. What could have brought the Spanish to make it?
The missing factor, in my view, is the North Atlantic Drift, the Gulf Stream. They didn't know it existed. They were navigating by dead reckoning, so that as they thought they were making headway westwards, they were in fact losing about 25 miles a day by not knowing to deduct the allowance for the North Atlantic Drift.
The Gulf Stream is one of the world's most powerful currents. Rising in the Gulf of Mexico, at its peak it's 5 times stronger than all the world's rivers combined. Even after reaching the British Isles, its energy remains formidable and, to the unwary, unpredictable.
I don't think that the Spanish would have had any concept that this current continued anything like as far north as it does. They might have been familiar with parts of this current further across the Atlantic from their voyages between Spain and the Americas, but it's most unlikely that they would have had any knowledge that this current carried this far north or retained this much strength at these latitudes.
How might the Gulf Stream have affected the Armada? For 10 full days in late August, bad weather blocked any progress southwards. Instead, as Aramburu's record shows, the Spanish tried to head out into the Atlantic. But with the Gulf Stream against them, any impression that they were making headway could well have been an illusion. When the wind finally turned on September the 3rd, they clearly felt confident that they could steer safely home to Spain. But if in fact they were further east, that fatal turn would bring them directly onto the coasts they had been trying to avoid. Ken's theory is new. No Armada history has ever questioned the Spaniards' navigation. But how plausible is it? The only way to find out is to put it to the test. Roger Proctor is an expert on ocean currents.
So we have to think about how fast the ship can actually sail into a current like this, with the fact also that there is wind and wave activity.
His computer model is more often used for tracking oil spills or drifting mines than 16th century warships.
And whether or not the ship can actually sail into that kind of...
And it would be losing ground.
And it would be losing ground. So
Good.
it could actually be going backwards instead of going forwards, as it thought it was.
Yes.
But by combining the observations of Aramburu with what we now know of weather and sea conditions, it may be possible to recreate the Armada's true course in September 1588.
Well, we've pretty well factored in most of these things now. So we have some idea of the currents due to the winds.
Yeah.
We have some idea of the winds themselves, the wind's directions, and we have some idea that the ship was sailing at the time.
It's not straightforward. In these northern waters, the Gulf Stream is constricted and flows at only half a knot. Wind speed and ocean depths also affected.
You know, with a 20-knot wind, if that could add an extra 0.4 of a knot to the current against the ship.
Yeah, I mean, one of the factors we have to be thoughtful about is the North Atlantic current is actually quite a narrow feature, so the positioning here is quite critical.
The first run-through isn't promising. It seems that Aramburu could have cleared Ireland easily.
The wind turns around and enables him to sail at a good speed down across the Rockall Bank, then misses Ireland completely. This assumes that the ship is actually fairly efficient in its sailing.
But this track is based on a first-rate sailing ship handling well. To reproduce the performance of the Spanish vessels, they will need to adjust the profile of the computer model.
Yeah,
safely.
That's right.
So there could well be other ships coming in, drifted east, and they would be the ones that come down on the Irish coast.
They could be,
yeah.
As we know, the Spanish ships did not sail well against the wind.
So it's really down to the efficiency that the ship can sail when it's trying to batter through its way through stormy conditions, really.
Many ships also had structural damage, and their crews were exhausted.
By the time these guys got this far west, they'd have been pretty much starving, in a pretty sorry state, weren't they?
Yes.
Their efficiency would have dropped off a lot.
Yes, that's it.
To reproduce the likely sailing qualities of Aramburu's ship, Roger makes one final adjustment. Then, 400 years on, the Spanish once again struggle against the Gulf Stream as they head for home.
In this calculation here, then, we're really assuming the captain is having difficulty sailing into the wind at all. He can't make a process it. So, I mean, normally...
Seems to be heading for Ireland.
Well, it's heading due south at the moment. August 20th, before that. It's quite surprising.
That's not far away. Yeah, I could agree with that.
The effect of the current is slight but insidious, and over a period of time, deadly. In the grip of the Gulf Stream, Aramburu turns, as he thinks, for Spain. And despite a desperate struggle to avoid it, he is thrown onto a hostile shore.
Just brings it alive. I'm trying to work it out in my imagination, and there it is in real life. Well, you have to feel sorry for the crews who had already experienced a tremendous amount of privation. They'd suffered battle damage and they'd suffered heavy weather damage. And here they were out in seas, as they said themselves, almost unknown to them. And the fact is they didn't know where they were. They must have felt completely lost.
In a matter of days, some 40 Spanish ships appeared on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. And once on the shoreline they had tried so hard to avoid, many found it impossible to get off again. They were pounded to pieces by storms. To this day, no one knows how many were lost, but almost half the ships that had sailed from Spain so proudly never returned. God blew, and they were scattered, reads the medal commemorating England's deliverance. Elizabeth, like Philip, put her faith in God, not men. But the Armada was not sunk by the weather alone, and certainly not by English gunfire. Those who died were victims of a colossal error of navigation, and of a natural phenomenon whose existence they never even suspected.